Thank you so much for being here. I am Melinda McCrary from the Richmond Museum of History and Culture, and I am delighted to welcome you all back to the museum for the first event since February 22nd of last year. So I'm feeling really excited and also a little nervous, but thank you so much for being here today. I just have a couple comments, and then I'm going to introduce our introducer. But first I want to say thank you to our sponsors. Thank you so much to the Contra Costa Central Labor Council, the Building Trades, thank you, and also our local firefighters union, who did also donate some money to make this possible today. So I really just want to say thank you so much. I am deeply indebted to Robert Cherny for helping me through the process to restore the mural, the Richmond Industrial City mural by Victor Arnautoff. And there is one other person I want to thank. If he's not here, hopefully he'll be here soon. There is a member of the museum, Fran Capoletti. And Fran was the first person who told me about the existence of the mural. And so I am also indebted to Fran. He'll be here, and I'll make him stand up. But I also want to say thank you so much to Michael Nye. Michael Nye is a executive board member for the Contra Costa Central Labor Council, and he was instrumental in securing one of the donations. Thank you so much, Michael Nye, for being here and helping support the event, and also for introducing Professor Cherny.
Bob helped immensely, as Melinda said. Please, if you haven't seen the mural, take a look at it. Restoring it was an incredible project. And remember, it was put in the basement of the post office, and people forgot that it was there. So this was truly a wonderful find and a cooperative effort of a number of institutions, including the museum here. So Bob will take questions, but please hold them afterwards so he doesn't get thrown off on his pace. So, Bob, an honor to see you again, Dr. Robert Cherny.
Thank you, Mike. Is this on? Yes. Thank you, Mike. It has been a long time, and I have really good memories of working with you, not only in the Labor Studies program, but in the initial years of the labor archives at San Francisco State. The story about finding the mural in the basement, I think maybe we'll leave that for the question and answer period, because Melinda is the best person to talk about that. And if any of you don't know that story, I think that would be a good thing for us to do when I finished. Today, I'm expecting to talk for about 20 or 35 minutes, or 30 or 35 minutes or so, and save your questions until I'm done, please. Next slide. Victor Arnautoff was arguably the most prominent muralist in Northern California during the 1930s, a time when federal funding provided more public art than any time before or since. Next slide. No, back one. There we go. Arnautoff was born in 1896 in a small village near the city of Mariupol in what was then southern Russia. Okay, next slide. His father was a Russian Orthodox priest. Young Victor studied in the local gymnasium, and he was such a promising artist that he received special tutoring. He planned to study art. Next slide. In 1914, however, all of Europe went to war. Young Victor was rushed through his final year of school and then sent to a school for cavalry officers. He was commissioned an ensign, promoted to lieutenant, and decorated for bravery in action. Next slide. The Imperial Russian government collapsed in February of 1917. In November, Lenin and the Bolsheviks seized power. In March of 1918, Lenin approved a draconian peace treaty that took Russia out of the war, but surrendered large parts of the country to the Germans. Next slide. The peace treaty outraged many Russians, especially officers who had fought in the war. It marked the beginning of civil war between the Bolsheviks' Red Army and the Whites, which was a loose alliance of several anti-Bolshevik groups. Next slide. Arnautoff was recruited into one of the White armies. After some initial victories, his section of the White Army engaged in a long retreat all the way across Siberia. You see where he joined and where he finally left. Late in 1920, Arnautoff crossed the border into China and left the war. He first went to Harbin, the largest Russian settlement in northeast China, and managed to scratch out a living by painting icons and lacquer boxes and attending the Lotus Art School there. Next slide. He soon found that he could earn a decent living by going to Mukden and working for Zhang Xiaolin, the local warlord, training his cavalry. In Mukden, he met and married Lydia Blonsky, nicknamed Lida, daughter of a former colonel in the Imperial Russian Army. Lida soon gave birth to two boys, Mikhail and Vasily. Next slide. Arnautoff still wanted to be an artist. Lida's father agreed to pay his tuition at the California School of Fine Arts in San Francisco, which is now called the San Francisco Art Institute. And Arnautoff set out for San Francisco in late 1925, ending his 10-year-long detour from his goal of becoming an artist. Next slide. Arnautoff studied with some of the leading artists in the West. He initially wanted to be a sculptor. Next slide. By 1928 or 1929, however, Arnautoff had become interested in doing large public murals, and he painted this self-portrait based on his plans to become a muralist. He came to see art as having an obligation to bring a message to a larger public, and he saw murals as one way to do that. Next slide. His first public mural is still in place at the Cathedral of the Holy Virgin, the old Cathedral of the Holy Virgin, on Fulton Street in San Francisco. It is a fresco, which is a type of art in which pigment is applied to wet plaster. The pigment penetrates the wet plaster so that it is more permanent than something that's just painted on canvas or on paper. However, a fresco artist must work very quickly and decisively to complete each section before the plaster dries. This painting was apparently done on a wooden frame and then attached to a wooden wall, the way that Arnautoff had learned to do fresco painting at the California School of Fine Arts. Next slide. By then, by the time that he finished that mural, his student visa was expiring and he had to leave the US. Ralph Stackpole, who was a leading faculty member at the school, encouraged Arnautoff to go to Mexico to work with Diego Rivera, who had been a friend of Stackpole since their student days in Paris. Since Arnautoff had to leave the country before he could come back in on a different visa, Stackpole wanted him to go to Mexico. Rivera was, at the time, the most prominent muralist in the world, based on his use of fresco to create large public murals depicting Mexican history. He was in and out of the Mexican Communist Party, and he spent a year in Moscow before being expelled for having anti-Soviet attitudes. Next slide. The Arnautoff family arrived in Mexico in early June of 1929. Rivera hired Arnautoff as an assistant, and Arnautoff later said that he finally learned how to paint fresco directly on a wall. Now, this is a project in Cuernavaca where Arnautoff was the assistant to Rivera for this entire project. It's a huge project, and this is just part of it. But I wanted to point out the use of grisaille in the lower panels here, something that Rivera did in this mural as a way of pointing out things that he found objectionable in the Spanish conquest. Well, he found the whole Spanish conquest objectionable, but these were particular aspects of it that he put into this grayscale as a comment upon what was going on in the mural up above. Next slide. In May of 1931, the Arnautoff family now included a son, Jacob. And in 1931, Rivera was in San Francisco. He had received a commission, and he left Arnautoff in charge of this project in Mexico City, which is undoubtedly Rivera's best known project. Arnautoff worked at preparing the wall. He didn't actually do the painting. So next slide. Rivera did this mural in San Francisco in what was then part of the new stock exchange. Stackpole was able to bring Rivera to San Francisco to do this, and Rivera also did a mural at the California School of Fine Arts, one which has been in the newspapers recently. In May of 1931, Arnautoff and the family returned to San Francisco. He set up a studio and soon attracted public attention by an exhibition of his paintings done in Mexico and by painting this fresco mural on the wall of his studio. It was originally 8 by 24 feet, featuring himself and other young San Francisco painters, as well as one of their models. We have only this black and white photograph of it. The original, of course, was in color. Next slide. News of Arnautoff's mural made it into all 4 of the city's daily newspapers. Only one published a photograph after putting clothes on the model. Next slide. In 1932, Arnautoff received a commission for several murals at the new Palo Alto Medical Clinic. The murals celebrate the medical triumphs of that time. 3 of the 4 color murals depict actual physicians from across the country who had made significant contributions to patient care, and the 4th shows an X-ray machine. Arnautoff created smaller murals in grisaille, just as Rivera had done at Cuernavaca, depicting ancient medicine, which is to say, this is modern medicine. This was ancient medicine, which was often very superstitious. Next slide. The murals created a traffic jam in Palo Alto as residents flocked to confirm that bare breasts were on public view at the new Palo Alto Clinic. If you've been to the Palo Alto Medical Center now, it's a brand big, huge new building, but they have put little small lunettes with versions of Arnautoff's original murals. And the original ones are still there, but they're behind a big chain link fence because the building is empty. Next slide. Adeline Kent, one of Arnautoff's fellow students from the 1930s, commissioned this mural for her studio. It does not survive, and all we have is this black and white photograph. But again, look at his use of grisaille. The center would have been color. The sides were grisaille to show things that in some way he thought objectionable. Next slide. The next year, in late 1933, a greater opportunity appeared. This tower had been built with a bequest from Lily Hitchcock Coit. It was originally intended to be a gallery exhibiting works on Pioneer Days in California. If you know, the area around it is Pioneer Park. Next slide. In May of 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt, who had recently been inaugurated as president, asked Congress to fund the Federal Emergency Relief Administration in order to relieve unemployment by creating work relief jobs. Late in 1933, Roosevelt and Harry Hopkins created the Civil Works Administration, which included the Public Works of Art Project, PWAP, for unemployed artists. The largest PWAP project was at Coit Tower. Next slide. Given Diego Rivera's recent work in the city, the plans for Coit Tower were changed to the creation of large murals in the style of Rivera. Walter Heil, the director of the DeYoung Museum, became chairman of PWAP District 15. For Coit Tower, he selected 25 artists from about 50 applications. For all PWAP art projects, the subject matter was specified to be the American scene. The subject matter for Coit Tower was specified to be San Francisco and California at the present time. Next slide. Arnautoff was chosen for a mural on city life, and he was also appointed as technical director for the entire project because of all the artists working there, he'd had the most experience working with Rivera. This is Arnautoff's City Life mural. It faces the south window. Critics praised Arnautoff's City Life mural, and Walter Heil called Arnautoff perhaps the most gifted of all the local muralists. In his mural, Arnautoff created a complex and richly detailed portrait of downtown San Francisco. He had roamed the city, making sketches of buildings and other features of the built environment, from major civic structures to modest filling stations, and there is a filling station over in that area. Next slide. The left side of the mural, up on top, relates to the industrial scenes that are around the corner at Coit Tower. And the right side shows the old produce market, which relates to the agricultural scenes around the corner in that direction. Near the center of the left side, on the left side, he stands a street sign for Washington and Montgomery Streets, which was the center of the city's art colony and also the northern edge of the financial district. Next slide. Arnautoff presented the Pacific Coast Stock Exchange, the sculpture there, and in the intersection in front, he presented an automobile accident, which I think may have been his way of suggesting a stock market crash. Next slide. Arnautoff, on the left here, depicted a well-dressed man being robbed by two other well-dressed men at the edge of the financial district, which was perhaps his comment on life in the financial district. On the right here, he showed his son, Michael, as a newsboy, and put in a self-portrait of himself looking out at you rather than looking at the magazines in the file. Next slide. Arnautoff's politics had begun to move to the left under Rivera's influence. These woodcut prints were done shortly after he completed the Coit Tower mural during the 1934 longshore, maritime, and general strikes, which he later said caused him to see the inequities in American economic life. He did several such works through the 1930s and after. Just as he saw public murals as a way to bring art to a wider public, he also considered these kinds of prints where multiple copies could be made as another way to bring his work to a large audience. Next slide. Late in 1934, Arnautoff was commissioned to do a mural in this building at the Presidio of San Francisco. The mural is on the east side, on the left as we're facing it here, and it's visible from outside. If you want to see it, it has a glass wall in front of it, but you can see the whole mural very easily without going inside. Next slide. It's not possible to get the whole thing into one photograph. The center of the mural is a statue of St. Francis. Next slide. And as one faces the mural, on the left side is the history of the Presidio, which Arnautoff chose to begin with the original people, with the first people of the area. And moving clockwise around, he shows them meeting with the Spanish colonizers. He shows the story up in the corner of Concepcion Arguello, the daughter of the commandant, and Nikolai Rozanov, a visiting nobleman from Russian North America, a very famous romantic and romanticized story. And the history section concludes with the arrival of the Americans. Next slide. The right half of the mural shows the peacetime activities of the Army as of 1934, including aviation and wireless communication. And in the center, the Army's role in supervising the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, another New Deal project. And down in the lower right corner, the planning for the Golden Gate Bridge, one anchor of which is in the Presidio, and which was being built at the time that this mural was being painted. Next slide. Arnautoff's next and largest New Deal project was at the new George Washington High School, a project that was completed in 1936. The artwork at the school was funded by the WPA, the Work Projects Administration, which had a special program for unemployed artists. Arnautoff carefully researched his topic, which was the life and era of George Washington. As he put it at the time, for a long time, nothing but reading. He hadn't studied American history when he went to school in Russia, after all. In his murals, Arnautoff presented his understanding of Washington's life and times. I conclude that his developing political perspective as he moved to the left led him to present a counter-narrative to the usual accounts that appeared in most high school history textbooks at the time. Next slide. As you walk in the door, this is the first one that's on the right, and it shows Washington's early life as a surveyor and an officer in the French and Indian War. But notice that Arnautoff put Native Americans in the center of the mural, beset on all sides by the French and the British. But he also showed them as well-armed and able to resist the colonizers. Next slide. This mural is on the opposite side as one enters, showing the origin of the American Revolution, the Boston Tea Party, the Boston Massacre. In the upper right, Washington takes command of the army, but in the center, Arnautoff put 4 men in working class clothing raising the new flag. And one of these working men in here does seem to be a person of color. Next slide. Smaller murals showed events of the Revolution, including the winter at Valley Forge, the surrender at Yorktown, and Washington's farewell to his officers. Next slide. Other small murals showed events in Washington's life after the Revolution, including his plan to create a national university and his efforts as president to mediate between Hamilton and Jefferson, something that everybody knows about now, right? Hamilton. Arnautoff's ceiling murals were more symbolic, including the one in the upper left here, showing Liberty placing new stars in the firmament. Next slide. 2 large murals in the upper hall continue Arnautoff's challenge to the usual accounts of Washington's life. This one shows Washington as the master of Mount Vernon, but Arnautoff chose to put enslaved black workers in the center and not Washington, emphasizing the dependence of Washington on slave labor and creating a counter-narrative to the usual accounts at the time that said little or nothing about the founding fathers being slaveholders. Next slide. This is the last in the series chronologically. It portrays Washington as a visionary pointing the nation west. Arnautoff said that he intended this mural to show, and I quote, "the march of the white race from the Atlantic to the Pacific," unquote, and the expansion of this nation, quote, "by war and peace," unquote. Like other artists on the left at that time, Arnautoff was making two choices about the subject matter at George Washington High School. First, he was choosing to include people of color, and he was choosing to depict them as victims of oppression. You know, here he has used grisaille, again, to show something objectionable, just as he did at the Palo Alto Clinic, just as Rivera did at Cuernavaca, but instead of putting it in a separate panel below, he put them right in the center. This is the expansion of the nation by war and the victims of war. On this side, he shows the expansion by peace, a white man and an Indian smoking a peace pipe, but over their head is a broken branch, which may have been intended to suggest broken treaties and broken promises. And far in the distance there, in the fog, is San Francisco. So he's showing the way in which the expansion of the US across the West involved both genocide and dispossession and broken promises and broken treaties. Next slide. By the mid and late 1930s, Arnautoff ranked among the leading artists in San Francisco. In 1938, the city's art community elected him King of Perilia, the art community's annual pageant, and that's his goofy costume. He was also elected as chairman of the Artists' Council of the San Francisco Art Association, served on the Fine Arts Committee for the Golden Gate International Exposition, and was elected to the board of directors of the Art Association. Two of his oil paintings won awards, as did a lithograph. Next slide. He also won awards not only for his art, but as a competitive fencer. He had learned fencing as a cavalry officer, and he kept up his skills as a member of the Olympic Club fencing team. Next slide. Shortly after Arnautoff finished the George Washington High School murals in June of 1936, he was one of 5 of the city's leading artists who were commissioned to create fresco lunettes for the library of the California School of Fine Arts. The other 4 got to do 1 or 2. Arnautoff was given 3, and they are the most prominent ones in the room. He called this sequence Art and Freedom. And on the left, as you look at them, and in the upper left here, Man Chained to Tradition depicts a man chained to a classical Ionic column with a bag of gold coins at his feet, suggesting the constricting nature of classical models and the need for money. In the center, the creative act shows the man inspired by nature. And on the right, Man Freed portrays the man breaking both his chain and the classical column to which it is bound. Next slide. By then, Arnautoff was arguing that an artist should be a social critic. In 1935, he told a reporter, quote, "I wish to deal with people to explain to them things and ideas they may not have seen or understood," unquote. He also defined the role of an artist as being, quote, "a critic of society," unquote. Victor and Lydia secretly joined the Communist Party in 1938. And the next year, in 1939, he wrote, quote, "A work of art is always propaganda because it always carries a message. The only question may be, propaganda of what? Unquote. He defined what he did as social realism, meaning it was a realistic portrayal of people and things rather than impressionistic or expressionistic, but it was focused on social issues or social patterns. Next slide. In 1937, Arnautoff received the first of 5 commissions for post office murals. One aspect of the New Deal's stimulus program was the construction of many new federal office buildings, especially post offices. Nearly all of the new post offices had a mural by an unemployed artist, and the murals were all supposed to represent the American scene, past or present. However, commissions were awarded on the basis of merit. This was not work relief available to just anyone. All of Arnautoff's post office murals were oil on canvas. He was no longer doing fresco. And they were painted in his studio in San Francisco rather than on site. Next slide. His first post office mural was for College Station, Texas. It has not survived. I've tried to find out whatever happened to it, but that post office was remodeled and it disappeared, and my friends at Texas A&M weren't able to find out anything about it. It shows the back-breaking toil of black sharecroppers and the easier life of white Texans. Notice the black sharecroppers are on their knees picking cotton, and there's this white Texan in a modern tractor going in the opposite direction. He shows the black workers and the white worker just moving in opposite directions. At the background, we've got oil wells spewing wealth into the sky. We have a black sharecropper having to go to a white weighman to weigh his cotton. Arnautoff was clearly choosing to depict people of color, but to show them once again as victims of oppression. Next slide. This is Arnautoff's second post office mural, also in Texas. Again, showing the difficult work of picking cotton by hand. The title, The Last Crop, refers to the last time cotton was picked by hand because that work was being replaced by machines. In the center distance here stands a large 2-story house surrounded by stately trees, presumably the home of the landowner. And in the upper right is a small, unpainted structure next to a spindly, leafless tree, presumably the home of some of the black cotton pickers. As with the College Station mural, Arnautoff chose to present the economic divide between white Texans and black Texans. Arnautoff's attention to issues of race and class in his Texas post office murals is the more striking when we realize that the 11 black workers in these 2 murals account for about half of all black people in the 69 post office murals painted in Texas in the 1930s. Next slide. There's no social criticism in this one, his third post office mural in Pacific Grove, California. The upper drawing shows his full-scale drawing that he submitted. Edward Rowan, the supervisor of the post office art program, was pleased with the children. He was much less pleased with the woman. He told Arnautoff that the woman in the bathing suit was, quote, distressingly insistent physically, unquote, and that Arnautoff should put clothes on her, which he did, as you see down below. Rowan had become very concerned about nudity in post office murals as a result of experience, and so I think that's what's going on here. Next slide. We're going to take Arnautoff's last post office mural out of sequence. This is the one in South San Francisco. The one at Pacific Grove is still there. You can go see it. It's in good shape. The one in South San Francisco is still there, also in good shape. Unlike all the others, he did 3 separate oil paintings. The cowboy on the left refers to the area's history as grazing land for San Francisco slaughterhouses, and the steel worker on the right symbolizes the area's industrial presence as of the early 1940s. And then he put a view of the city in the center. Again, Arnautoff chose to depict working people. Next slide. Arnautoff's fourth post office mural is the one here in Richmond. He visited Richmond several times in February and March of 1940 and talked with the postmaster and the local newspaper editor. He probably talked to the city manager and mayor too, as we'll see. He wrote at the time, quote, "Richmond is an industrial city." And he listed, this is his message to Edward Rowan in Washington about preparation for it. He listed the oil refineries, a Ford assembly plant, other manufacturing, and a port. So this first sketch, he said, is a result of his discussions here. He said, quote, "We decided that the main subject of the mural should be the people of Richmond, with oil tanks and factories as a background. Therefore, in my sketch, on one side, I presented collective bargaining over here. On the other side, people walking on the street going about their business." Unquote. Next slide. In the second sketch, Arnautoff changed the collective bargaining scene from what he had called, quote, "mere arguing," unquote, to one in which the men were reviewing copies of a contract. So these are still Ford assembly plant workers over here. By presenting collective bargaining on one side of the mural, Arnautoff was pointing to the reality that many of Richmond's residents had joined unions and secured the right to collective bargaining in the previous half-dozen years. Rowan suggested several changes in this drawing. He praised one part of it as beautifully and sensitively achieved, but he called the group of people on the left quite without inspiration. So this is Rowan's commentary on this drawing, and that's Arnautoff's letter up at the top. This is Rowan's article down here in which he responded to Arnautoff and suggested a few changes. Next slide. So here we have the last drawing and we have the finished mural. The completed mural was installed in early March of 1941. And the local postmaster immediately described it as, quote, "beautiful," and said that it depicted, quote, "the different stanzas of life surrounding the city of Richmond." Next slide. Here's what it looked like in place. And what you see is that it had to be cut out over the top of the door. There was also some kind of a cigar and cigarette stand that Arnautoff felt was getting in the way, and it apparently had been moved by the time this photograph was made. Okay, next slide. Here's the left side of the mural with a woman buying what I think are peaches, maybe apricots, from a grocer. And we were just discussing upstairs that the grocer is actually, what's the name? James McVitie, who was then city manager, sometimes mayor, obviously someone Arnautoff had talked to about the mural. And Melinda tells me that the man in the hat is also probably identifiable as someone who was in the city at the time. And the other thing that he added the high school. The high school building had been in the first sketch. It disappeared from the second sketch. It came back in the final mural. And he added a letter carrier, which seemed so appropriate for something in a post office to give recognition to the workers of the post office. Next slide. And oh, wait, go back a minute. There was something else I want to say about that. You notice the young man here reading the newspaper. That's also changed from the other sketch. The other sketch had been, I think, a newspaper boy getting ready to deliver his papers because there was a big stack of them. Now it's just a young man reading a newspaper. And we may guess that as of late 1940, early 1941, this young man is rather anxious about the news in the newspapers because a war was raging in Europe. Now, given Arnautoff's sensitivity to race, you're probably wondering why there is only one black person in the entire mural. Arnautoff did visit Richmond several times to observe the people. The 1940 census of Richmond showed that the city was 98% white. So in depicting the people of Richmond, he was depicting what he saw on the street, but he made a point of including one person of color. So next slide. On the right side of the mural. Now these are not Ford assembly plant workers, these have now become longshoremen at the Port of Richmond. You see there's a ship tied up here somewhere off that we don't see, and the longshoremen are taking their lunch break. We also know they're longshoremen because this guy has his hook in his back pocket. Longshoremen worked with a hook, with a handle. We also see Union buttons on the hats of the two on the left. The other ones are facing us, so their Union buttons would be on the side of their hats that we don't see. Interesting, by choosing to change from Ford assembly plant workers to longshoremen, Arnautoff was able to depict members of the International Longshoremen's and Warehousemen's Union, the ILWU, which was one of the most left unions in the country at that time. And just as a sidelight, years later, long after he finished this, Arnautoff's two younger sons, Vasily and Jacob, both became longshoremen and members of the ILWU, and they spent their working lives doing that. Vasily in San Francisco and Jacob in Seattle. Next slide. Trying to read my note to myself here. Oh, yeah. I want again, the Union buttons and the longshoreman's hook. And interestingly, he includes, of course, a black longshoreman. Instead of showing oppression of people of color in this mural, he's now showing a black worker as an equal to the white workers in this work gang. And that's because he was undoubtedly aware of the history of the ILWU in opening their union to all, regardless of race, creed, religion, color, politics. And the ILWU had eliminated the segregated work gangs that had been typical of longshore work before the 1930s. So instead of depicting a black person as a victim of oppression, here he was celebrating the equality and the inclusion that was being practiced by a left union. Next slide. He was paid the sum of $1,100 for the mural, which had to include all of the materials and even the scaffolding. So, you know, he may have cleared half of that. $1,100 in 1941 would have had about the same purchasing power as $21,000 today. Still, you know, if he cleared half of that. He was also teaching at Stanford at the time, and his salary at Stanford that year was $1,500 annual, not monthly. $1,500. Next slide. Arnautoff had begun teaching part-time in the art department at Stanford in the spring of 1938. He became an assistant professor in 1944. But because he had never graduated from any college, he never advanced beyond an assistant professor. He later explained that this self-portrait from 1941 had him looking very serious because it was at the time of the war in Europe and at a time when it looked as though the US might be pulled into that war at some point in the foreseeable future. Next slide. And of course, in mid-1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union, just shortly after that previous self-portrait had been painted. Victor and Lydia threw themselves into activities to support the Russian war effort and the Russian people. Here's Arnautoff in the back row, helping to promote a public meeting in defense of the Soviet Union and to raise funds for Russian war relief. He later remembered that he had little time for painting during the early years of the war. His public activities on behalf of Russian war relief brought him to the attention of the FBI, which opened a file on him in October of 1941. Next slide. After World War II, in addition to teaching at Stanford, he taught at the California Labor School, an organization founded and directed by the local Communist Party. The school, however, aimed at a much broader student body than just party members. Some classes, especially in the arts, had minimal political content. Arnautoff taught essentially the same courses at the California Labor School that to working people at the California Labor School that he taught to the students at Stanford. The printmaking classes of the Labor School evolved into the Graphic Arts Workshop, which is a cooperative that still exists today. But the school itself was closed in 1955. Next slide. Arnautoff's politics remained well to the left. In this self-portrait, he depicted himself in front of a sign reading HR 9490 with a red slash through it. HR 9490 was the Internal Security Act, which required members of the Communist Party to register with the Attorney General and gave the federal government broad powers to exclude or deport suspected communists. It was passed in 1950 over the veto of President Harry Truman, who argued that among other problems, quote, it would put the government of the United States in the thought control business, unquote. In 1944 and 1948, Victor and Lydia applied for permission to move to the Soviet Union and were turned down both times. The FBI classified them as DETCOM, meaning communist subject to detention in a national emergency, and COMSAB, meaning communist suspected of sabotage. The FBI removed the COMSAB classification when they learned that there were no defense contracts in the Stanford Art Department and that his Stanford colleagues all vouched for his patriotism. Next slide. In 1955, Arnautoff found himself back in the headlines when this print was removed from the annual San Francisco Art Festival. He described this cartoon as, quote, a composite and symbolic characterization of McCarthyism, unquote. I don't know if you can read the little bucket of red paint, but it says smear. The reason given for the removal was that it caricatured Vice President Richard Nixon. The head of the art festival, who ordered the removal of the cartoon after receiving a call from the FBI, was surprised at the outpouring of support for Arnautoff, but he assured a reporter that it would all blow over very quickly. Next slide. It did not. The Nation gleefully put Dick McSmear on its cover the next month. Conservative papers, however, listed Arnautoff's ties to organizations that had communist ties and concluded that he was a communist and should be fired by Stanford. Next slide. Stanford President Wallace Stirling had stated repeatedly that a communist had no place in a college classroom. Outraged Stanford alumni wrote to Stirling demanding that the university fire Arnautoff. Arnautoff was asked to come and talk with Stirling, which he did. He was also interviewed by the Faculty Advisory Board on Personnel Matters to determine if he should be fired, but the faculty members decided in his favor. Next slide. The next year, in December 1956, Arnautoff was summoned before a subcommittee of the House Un-American Activities Committee at a hearing in San Francisco. He repeatedly cited the Fifth Amendment in refusing to answer questions about his membership in the Communist Party and several other organizations. And when he was asked if the Communist Party had directed him to make that cartoon of Nixon, he also took the Fifth Amendment, but he really laughed at the question. Next slide. Once again, the press contributed to a furor among Stanford alumni over Arnautoff, who could now be called a Fifth Amendment communist. Arnautoff wrote his own response to the hearing, and this is a quote now. "The un-American subcommittee knew very well that I had not committed any crime. An artist has as much right to make a political cartoon as any other citizen has to express a political opinion or viewpoint," unquote. Once again, he was asked to meet with the advisory board at Stanford. His answers to their questions emphasized his respect for and commitment to the US Constitution. Again, the advisory board voted not to terminate his appointment. As Arnautoff put it a bit later, quote, "They put up with me as they might a toothache," unquote. Next slide. Almost 2 years earlier, the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the Soviet Union had approved the Arnautoff's fourth application for Soviet citizenship. So, while lecturing the advisory board on the rights of American citizens, Arnautoff had already secretly renounced his American citizenship as a part of his application to immigrate to the Soviet Union. Of course, their applications were secret, and they had done nothing official to renounce their citizenship. Victor and Lydia now began their plans to emigrate when he retired from Stanford in 1962. In 1961, however, Lydia died after being hit by a car. Victor retired from Stanford the next year. He later recalled, quote, "I felt myself an unwanted guest in America," unquote. And he continued with his plans to emigrate. He left in 1963, taking with him a large number of his paintings, drawings, and prints. Next slide. Once established in the town where he had grown up, which was now renamed Zhdanov, he resumed working on large public murals. This postcard from Arnautoff to his son shows his first public mural in the Soviet Union. It's that 3-story high mural on the side of the building that housed the post office and telephone office. He was inspired to make the mural in mosaic after he traveled to Kiev and saw ancient mosaic murals there. This mural depicts postal workers, but the dominant feature is a Soviet rocket. Arnautoff was very proud of Soviet accomplishments in space at that time, at which he described in a letter as a great force for peace. Next slide. That mural is in very bad shape today, but you do see some of the postal workers here. Since it was little mosaic mural tiles, they just have been falling off the side of the building. Next slide. His second mural, which he thought was better than the first, was also done with small ceramic tiles on the wall of an elementary school. Next slide. It is in somewhat better condition today than the first one. And in color, of course, you can see that all of the children have little red neckerchiefs, which meant they were all members of the Young Pioneers, which was the young people's organization of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union. Next slide. It is entitled From the Scythians to the Cosmos, and it depicts the history of that region from the earliest times to the space age. These two show ancient battles and the victory of the Red Army in the Civil War, a subject that Arnautoff knew very well personally. Next slide. The top one here shows the defeat of the German invasion during World War II, and the bottom one is a rather idealized version of everyday Soviet life in his own time. Next slide. Arnautoff remarried to a Russian art critic from Leningrad, and they moved there for the final years of his life. He continued painting there and making prints, but there were no more large murals. He died in 1979. So you can take the last slide, which is an absolutely shameless plug. I'm happy to take your questions or your comments. So, in the back, Mike. The question is to compare what's happened with the George Washington High School mural with what's happened here. Well, I don't, it would take an hour or more to discuss what's happened at George Washington High School, but you probably all have at least some awareness that at some point about, 2.5 years ago or so, the school board voted first to paint them out, and then at their next meeting to cover them up. And they were going to spend, $250,000 to cover them up because they were considered to be offensive to some students. The Alumni Association sued the school board for violating the California Environmental Quality Act. They were in violation at that last school board meeting. I had my 2 minutes to comment. My comment was, you are going to violate the California Environmental Quality Act if you pass this measure. Don't blame people who sue you to obey the law if you're not following the law. And of course, they were sued. It's still in court. The last I knew, all of the things that the judges had done up to this point were favorable to the Alumni Association and not to the school board. So that's where that is. The school has been closed, as you know, for more than a year. They were doing a lot of seismic work with the school, but to the best of my knowledge, nothing has been done to the murals. Now, of course, the contrast to what happened here is quite dramatic. Here, an Arnautoff mural has been rescued from oblivion. Maybe Melinda could say just a little bit more about how she found it and what. Do you want to do that?
Sure.
Good.
So go in front. Okay.
Take your mask off.
So Fran is here, so I want to say thank you. Thank you to Fran. It was in 2014 when I was a new director that Fran and I were sitting upstairs in my office, and he mentioned that the mural existed. I started to research and talk to people. My board member, John Z., put me in touch with the former postmaster, who put me in touch with the janitor who still worked at the post office. And we broke the law, and I went into the federal building, and he actually he was the original person who found the crate, and it was in a room that had not been illuminated in like a decade. So nobody had changed the light bulb in there for quite some time. And so it was always in the post office. Ironically, it was supposed to be sent to the conservator's office in Southern California, but it was never mailed from the post office. Thanks, happy for us. But what happened because I tried to get the mural removed from the building, and it was not easy to do that. And I even had a loan agreement from the Federal Preservation Officer for the United States Postal Service, and it was only the flood. There was a flood at the post office, and I learned about the flood, and I panicked because I knew the mural was still in the basement. But when I went there to finally pick up the mural, we opened the crate, and the conservator, who's actually Nathan Zockheim. Nathan Zockheim's dad was one of the artists at Coit Tower, Bernard. Nathan had put the mural on stilts. So it was like 6 inches off the ground, so the water actually got into the crates, but it never actually touched the canvas. So there was so it was just a series of unlikely events. And then, so that was just the first leg, and then it took us 5 years collectively to raise the $50,000 plus it cost to restore the mural, because there was a bunch of lead-based adhesive on the back. And, that was another thing that, it was small donations from individuals, like many of you here in this room, that got us up to the 50,000. We didn't get any big grants from, as larger museums do. So it's really a by the people, for the people, of the people, kind of restored by the people as well. And I feel really thankful to, and the professor did several fundraising events for us as well. So, we hustled for several years to raise enough money. And then we sent it up to Goleta, and then there was a pandemic and everything else. So it was really wonderful and a community effort.
Other questions or comments? Yes, go ahead.
Yes, a few years back there was an earthquake in Cuernavaca. Was that mural injured or destroyed?
I don't know. I don't know what.
It was very severe.
Yeah, I do remember reading about that, but I don't remember seeing anything about what may have happened to that mural. Behind you, and then, yes.
Okay. Didn't Victor desert the White Army and go and become part of the Red Army in his early years when he was Phyllis Mandel, by the way?
No. If you, as nearly as I can figure out, in his memoirs, he says something to the effect that he was first recruited into the Red Army, but there was a bunch of confusion and his unit didn't move out, and then he was recruited into the White Army. Now, I think that was convenient for writing a memoir in the Soviet Union. One of the things one of these amazing coincidences that happened when I was doing the research was that I needed someone to translate Russian for me, because I had a lot of sources that needed translation. So I went to one of my colleagues at San Francisco State and said, can you recommend someone as a translator? And she recommended someone who did my translations, but whose grandfather, it turned out, had been in the very same military unit with Arnautoff during World War I. They'd both been officers in the very same unit. And her understanding from the research she had done on her own family's history was that all of those officers, when the army was dissolved, they all went to the same town, Simbirsk, and that's where they were all recruited into the White Army, essentially as a group. So I don't think that Arnautoff was attracted to the Bolsheviks. I don't think he was attracted to the Red Army at that time. In his FBI file, there's an interview with someone who knew Arnautoff in the 1920s and who had also been in one of the White Armies. And this FBI informant said Arnautoff was anti-communist in the 1920s. And this fits better with other parts of his history. The influence of Diego Rivera, the influence of the 1934 strikes. He also said in his memoirs that the Spanish Civil War was very important in terms of his political development.
Well, his father was a Russian priest.
Yes.
So, I mean, he came from a very traditional, juiced into the
Oh, yes.
powers that be system.
His father was an Orthodox priest. His mother came from a background that included Cossacks, also very strong supporters of the Tsar and so forth. But also, his mother was related to an English engineer who had come to St. Petersburg in the 1790s and whose family were architects and artists. And so he always thought that he had inherited some of his artistic talent through his mother's ancestors who had been architects. If you can picture in your mind, there's some of the big pictures of Red Square. At one end of Red Square, there's a huge museum. At the other end is St. Basil's Cathedral. It was one of these remote cousins of Arnautoff that designed that museum at one end of Red Square. Let me get another question from the back and then I'll come back. No, I'll get.
I'm curious about the four men in the mural, the two facing us on the left had caps on, and the other two had fedoras.
Yeah.
Does that have any relevance?
I don't think so. I looked at that too. The white caps were pretty typical of longshore workers, but they didn't all wear them. You know, if you look at pictures of longshore workers, some of them, they're all wearing something on their heads. You know, at that time, men always wore something, they caps or hats. I think that he was just sort of going by what he saw on longshore workers. If you saw the sketches of the Ford assembly plant workers, they were all wearing hats as well. I don't think there's any particular significance between the white hats and the other hats, or the white caps. They're over here, and then I'll come back to you.
This is kind of a minor point. In that political cartoon he did, Richard Nixon, you know, he had the bucket with the spear in one hand. He was holding a pumpkin.
Yes. Yes. Ha-ha. That's all about the pumpkin papers, which, and I'm trying to remember all the details here. Someone can help me. Whitaker Chambers and Richard Nixon on the Un-American Activities Committee was involved with you know, finding these supposed secret documents that had been hidden in a hollowed out pumpkin. So that's the reason for the pumpkin. That was obvious to everyone at the time why there was a pumpkin. Why it was that this Nixon-like figure was holding a pumpkin. Now, yes.
Well, I just wanted to make a couple of comments about it. My name is Mandel. I'm Bill's daughter. You know who we talked the last time
Yes.
you were here. And my father knew Victor very, very well.
Yes.
He was my father was an expert on the USSR, and he met Victor when my father had a fellowship at Stanford in the mid-1940s, before they started trying to throw everybody out who they thought was communists. And one of the things that I remember Victor very well, and what's interesting to me is the photo at the end of him. At the end of the show, there's a photo of him. Yeah, no, the photo.
The previous one?
Is that the photo or is, no, here it is, okay. The photo is much, to me, is much more realistic of what he looked like. He was an incredibly handsome man. And the portrait that he does of himself doesn't show his character as much, his humanness as much as the photo, as this photo does.
That's interesting. In my book, yes, thank you, and thank you for the comment. If you look in my book, I quote your father about his first meeting with Victor, in which he praised one of Victor's works. Victor said something like, well, you want to take a couple of these? And he gave your father one. No, first your father gave Victor a book that he'd written, and Victor then gave him a painting. And your father said, oh, that's not, not equal. And Victor said, it probably took you longer to write that book than it took me to paint the painting. And I was so impressed with his collection. You know, I did at some point see all of Victor's paintings that your father had acquired, and you're so lucky. Let's see, what else? Somebody else had a hand. No? Yes?
So when's your Bridges book coming out? When's your Bridges book coming out?
Well, if all goes well, sometime next year. The question is, when is my biography of Harry Bridges coming out? And that's my next really big project. I sent it off to my editor a year ago in March. It went through 4 peer reviews. The biggest thing they told me to do differently was to cut out about 300 pages. I started with 900, so. And I did. I managed to cut out 300 pages. And now my editor is supposed to get back to me any day about the next steps. And she said, if all goes well, it'll probably actually be in print late next year.
Two questions. Who's your publisher? And talk about going to the USSR to do research on this.
So the question is, who is my publisher? University of Illinois Press, same publisher as the Arnautoff book. I think that, I sold both of those books at the same time to an editor from the University of Illinois Press. I think she really wanted the Harry Bridges book, but I said, it's a package deal. And furthermore, there have to be colored pictures in the Arnautoff book. And she said, well, of course. So, I knew this was a good place for both books. What's the other question? Doing research in Russia. I started the Harry Bridges project a long, long time ago, about 1985, before some people in the room had even been born. And I would work on it and then set it aside and work on it. And at some point, there was a newspaper article that got immediately sent to me that a newly opened archive in Moscow had information that Harry Bridges was a member of the Communist Party. So I knew I had to go do research in this archive. And fortunately, I was able to get a Fulbright appointment to teach American history at Moscow State University in the spring of 1996. And the teaching load was the lightest teaching load I have ever had. I had 1 lecture 1 afternoon a week and 1 tutorial 1 afternoon a week. And that left me 3-4 days of the week to go to this archive. And I actually did end up spending probably an average of 3 days a week at that archive for a semester, which was just time enough to look at what was there from the Communist Party of the United States dealing with California and maritime unions. That's all I looked at. It's a huge, huge archive. And it's all materials that were sent there by the American Communist Party for safekeeping between the mid-1920s and the late 1930s. And there's also files there of the various committees of the Comintern whose work was related to the United States. So I went through all of those as well. And I went back a second time in 2004 to spend another month or so in that archive. And I found very little about Harry Bridges. I found very little about Harry Bridges, but I found a lot of really interesting information about the Communist Party in California. So the next book, after the Harry Bridges book comes out, is going to be a book about the Communist Party in San Francisco that's based, at least in part, on those files from Moscow.
Where's the mural now?
Where is?
Where is the mural?
Oh, it's upstairs. On the wall. They did a really beautiful job. The first time I came here, Melinda said, this is where it's going to go. And that's where it is.
So let's give a final So I want to say two things before, while I have you all here as a captive audience. First of all, if you want to read more about the Forrest Gump of the early 20th century and Victor Arnautoff, I do suggest that you buy the book here and not on Amazon. Please buy it, because Professor has agreed to autograph your copy. So please buy it. We have plenty of copies available. And secondly, I hope that you all enjoyed this beautiful educational event. And if you could imagine, if we could do something this great for adults, what could we do for children? Tatiana, can you please stand up? Tatiana is our museum educator. She does our K through 12 programs, right? And every child in Richmond should have the opportunity to come to the museum in the next academic year to see this new mural, to see working class people, to see fine art in our own museum right here. And so I'm asking you today, you came to this free event, to please make a donation to our K through 12 educational program. Take out your wallet, write a check, because not only do we provide free field trip with Miss Tatiana, but we also provide transportation, because our district can't afford to provide buses. So please help us. Please write a check or donate money today to our K through 12 educational program, so that Tatiana and I can bring every student, every child in Richmond here to see this beautiful mural. So thank you so much.